Good evening, everybody. I'd like to invite you to join me in applauding Les Schrenk as he shares his World War II experiences with us.
Thank you very much. On my 19th birthday, I enlisted in the Army Air Force. Up until that time, I hadn't been away from home, not even a single night. I hadn't been over 50 miles from home, and little did I realize that it'd be about 3 years that would elapse before I got back home. I flew as a ball turret gunner and as an aerial engineer in a B-17. I had already finished my basic training, my mechanical training, my gunnery training, and now I'm at flight training, and the pilots are choosing their crew. This nice-looking, well-mannered second lieutenant called about a dozen of us off to one side and started asking questions. Most few minutes, he turned to me and he said, "Would you care to join my crew?" Of course, I was rather flattered that he would choose me, and I said, "Certainly, sir." Then he went on to say, "It's a 10-man crew. You're the last man to fulfill the crew, and the only spot open is the ball turret." Well, up to that time, I really had very little knowledge of a ball turret. During mechanical training, we were training on B-25s and B-26s, and they didn't have a ball turret. So I really didn't know what I was getting into, but a few days later, I had my first chance to get into the turret, and I noticed that it was rather snug, but we were flying out of Alexandria Air Force Base in Louisiana. It was July, and the weather was very hot. So, of course, when we were airborne, we were only flying low level during the first part of the training, and the cool breeze actually felt very good, and I kind of liked the ball turret. It wasn't until we started flying high altitudes that I found out I had a great big problem. Now, for one thing, for those of you who don't know, a ball turret is in the belly of the aircraft. It's actually outside of the aircraft. To make an escape from it, you have to first get into the aircraft and then make your escape. When I was wearing my heavy flying suit, I found out that I couldn't even get into the turret. So we did have electric heated suit, and I decided, well, if I'll make the electric suit do. That was my one big mistake. After we got on the ground, I decided, well, maybe I should trade with another crew member, because usually a ball turret gunner is a very petite type of person, 5'6", 5'7", and I was 5'11". I found out that everybody was scared of the doggone thing. The reason they were scared, it's the absolute worst place to make an escape from if you're shot down. But nobody wanted it, so I was more or less stuck with it and decided to make do. My worst mission was my second mission. It was to we were to go to Aschersleben, Germany, to bomb an aircraft plant. The reason it was one of my worst missions was because in England in the winter, weather is very unfavorable. It can change in just a couple hours. We were well on our way to the target, and unbeknown to us, all the other two air wings were called back because of bad weather. The only problem was our bomb wing didn't get the call back, so we went on to bomb the target alone. Just as soon as our escort left, the whole German Air Force pounced down on us and hammered the hell out of us. There was so many of us shot down, you could just see the path that the echelons before you had taken by the smoke plumes coming up from the ground where a B-17 had crashed. Then I found out how unreliable the electric heat suit was. All of a sudden I found a real bad burn in my leg. I looked down, there was a fire. I quickly put it out. The suit was on fire. I put it out, but then I had a real bad burn on my leg, and worse yet, the whole suit went out. So here we are, 60 below zero, and I've got a long, long way to go before I get back home again. I think the only thing that saved me from freezing to death was there were so many fighters coming in at us, and my adrenaline was so high that I actually had sweat running down my back. We continued on towards the target, and just before we got to the target, there was a great, big, loud explosion. It was so bad it actually flipped our airplane completely upside down. When the pilot righted the plane, number 2 engine, the whole rear half of it was gone. There was a hole in the wing about 4 feet across. Thank you very much. I've got the wrong type of ears. Anyway, we went on to bomb the target, and just as we left the target, there was another loud explosion. It wasn't quite as bad, but we were still with the formation, but then I noticed we couldn't keep up with the formation anymore. And when you can't keep up with the formation and you're between the echelons, you're a dead sitting duck. So the pilot gunned the engine as hard as he could and tried to keep up with the formation. Then when they were ahead of us, he throttled way back till the next echelons caught up with us. He did that 2 different times, and then we were tail end Charlie. There's nowhere to go anymore. So then the only option was he dove down into the clouds, and we were surrounded by clouds for hours. And that is really scary because you start wondering what else is in the clouds besides you. We kept on flying. Finally, he dropped down out of the clouds, and we found out we were above the English Channel. Then he called the other engineer and myself to give him a hand. We went up forward, and we found that the pilot and the co-pilot were just struggling for all their might on the yoke because the plane was in a diving motion. When that second shell hit our vertical stabilizer, it bent some metal, and when the other engineer and I took over, I couldn't imagine how hard we had to pull that yoke just to keep it level. And here the pilot and the co-pilot have been struggling with it like that for hours. we were so far behind that it was starting to get dark, and fog was setting in, and the pilot said, "I see an airfield down below." He said, "For some reason they don't answer my call, but I'm going to land there because I haven't got much choice." He landed. He made almost a perfect landing, even with all the battle damage. But then we almost collided with a pile of stumps. We found out why they didn't answer. It was the airport under construction. But we were very, very glad to be on the ground, and just thankful to be alive. I'm going to talk about Big Week. Big Week is a period in World War II. At the beginning of the war, Germany had complete air superiority over the Allies. But we were bombing aircraft assembly plants, and pretty soon Germany couldn't keep up with the production anymore, but the Allies could, because we were producing airplanes in Canada and the United States, and we were just outproducing Germany. So that turned the air war in the opposite direction. When I was flying, the magic figure was you were supposed to make 25 missions. During the time I was flying, I didn't know anybody that got anywhere near that. They were either shot down, killed, or so badly maimed that they couldn't fly anymore. The crew that I knew that was the highest was flying their 21st mission, and they had the misfortune of getting a direct hit, and all of them were killed. After Big Week, another thing that happened was we got fighter planes that could take us all the way to and from the target. So the ones that flew after Big Week had a much better chance of survival. And that's where you hear people say that they flew 40 and 50 missions. During the time I was flying, if you flew about 4 to 6 missions, that was about it. My last and 10th mission was to fly to Aalborg, Denmark. When we found out we were going to Denmark, we were very happy because Germany never did put up as much resistance over what we called friendly territory. To me, friendly territory is places like Denmark, France, Belgium, that were occupied by Germany, but they were controlled by Germany. The only thing is, after we found out that there was just a small contingent of us going there, they were using us as a decoy to lure the fighters away from the main targets in the Ruhr. We were attacked quite a bit on the way to the target, but the target was completely clouded over, so we decided not to drop our bombs and headed back to England. That's when the Germans really came in and pounded the heck out of us. A plane just to our right got hit, and I saw it crash into the ocean. Of course, I knew everybody was killed. Just a few minutes later, we had a loud explosion, and I looked out and I saw great big flames coming out of our number 4 engine. They must have been at least 20, 30 feet long, the flames. And every few seconds there was another explosion. Then I heard the pilot call out to the navigator. He said, where's the nearest land? The navigator came back immediately. He says, 20 minutes due east. So I knew we were going down. I never did see the airplane that shot us down, and later on, after I met him, he told me I didn't have a chance to see him. He said, because I made a shallow dive from the top of your airplane, and you wouldn't even have a chance to see me. In that raid, when we were over the English Channel, we lost 4 different airplanes, and each airplane had a crew of 10 men. After the war, I looked it up on the internet, and out of the 40 airmen that were lost that day, 31 of them were killed, 9 of us were captured. Like I said, the plane was on fire, and so I asked the pilot if I could exit the turret, and he gave the permission to do so because he had already surrendered by lowering his landing gear. Now, that was the sign of universal surrender. The only problem was that most Germans didn't adhere to it, and most of them would have just kept on firing and left us drowned in the English Channel. Anyway, I exited the turret, sat down in a bulkhead, by a bulkhead, and just waited to see what would happen. And I don't think any of us ever really did think that we would make landfall before the wing blew off, but somehow the wing hung on just long enough to make landfall, and then the wing blew off. The pilot managed to hold the plane steady, giving us a chance to bail out. The right waist gunner got to the door before he jettisoned the latch. Then he was froze and was afraid to jump out. I didn't hesitate. I took my boot and I gave him a great big boot in the rear. And I jumped out after him. Then I waited a few seconds and I pulled the parachute cord. Nothing happened. It wasn't that serious. I looked down. What had happened is a little parachute called the drogue chute that pulls the main parachute out. And it had just become stuck in the covers. I gave it a yank, and it came out, no problem at all. The parachutes we had were for Air Force only. They were real small parachutes because they knew that the Germans were shooting so many of our men after they bailed out while they were in the parachute. So they made our parachutes real tiny. After the war, I checked, and I found out that I would have hit the ground at about 13 miles an hour. Even in training, they told us it was the equivalent of jumping off a 2-story building, and I don't think that they minimized that one bit. As I was descending, the Germans were shooting at us from the ground, but all of a sudden they stopped for some reason. And as I neared the ground, there was a circle of Germans around where I was going to land. When I hit with a very hard force, and the only thing I got done to unsnap my parachute, it was frozen ground, but it thawing that day, and it was real muddy. So I deliberately stamped my parachute into the mud so that the Germans couldn't use it. And of course, about that time, they were pointing the guns at me, telling me to raise my hands. Of course, I did so, and they started frisking me and asking me in German if I had a weapon. And of course, we had absolutely no sidearms at all. And I made a mistake of answering him in German, thinking that maybe somehow that would help me. But I found out later it worked completely against me. They put me in a little tiny car that was powered by coal gas, because Germany had such a shortage of gasoline that they relied on anything to operate their vehicles. And they took me to a schoolhouse that they had taken over from the Danish people. There was about, I think, 3 or 4 of my crew there. And later on, they brought everybody in except the navigator and the pilot. And then pretty quick, the German came and had the pilot's, what we called the crash bracelet. It had his name and his rank and everything on it. Also, I think he had his rings and something else. Asked me if I could identify it. And of course, I knew who they belonged to, but we'd always been told to, unless you knew the person was dead, never identify anybody. So I told them, no, I don't know who they belong to. They kicked me out the door, and here was a wagon with the dead body, and they peeled back just enough where I could see the pilot's face. I tried to touch him, but they booted me away. They said, now maybe that'll refresh your memory. Of course, then I did identify him. And I'm going to give a little footnote here of how he died, and I'll get back to the main story again. I didn't find out how the pilot died until I got back to the crash site in 2008. The Danish people told me that he had made the misfortune of landing in a lake that had thin ice on it. He broke through the ice and was yelling for somebody to fish him out. There was a bunch of Danish people that went out trying to help him, but the Germans shot at him and made him go away and left the poor pilot drown. Then after he was dead, then they made the Danes go out and get him. Anyway, I went back into with the rest of the crew and gave them the bad news of what had happened. It was about right after that that they hadn't discovered my escape kit. When we were flying, they gave each of us what we call an escape kit. It had maps and even had a little hacksaw, had French francs to use to bribe people, and I didn't want the Germans to have it, so I asked to go to the latrine, and when they weren't watching, I started to flush the maps and started to flush the money down the drain, but I must have put it in too quickly, and it plugged up the toilet. Then I had no choice but to tear it up and throw the rest of it in the toilet and asked to go back to the room. Pretty quick, I heard yelling and screaming and everything, and some poor kraut was getting read the riot act for letting me destroy the escape kit. And they took me into the commandant's office and searched me. Then they found out I had well, it was actually a British wallet that had some British money in it and a few American dollars. They grabbed the money and gave me the empty wallet back. And I looked at him and I said, I want a receipt for that. He said, why? And I said, because we're going to win the war, and after the war, I'm going to collect. Oh, did that make him mad? He just got red. Take that swinehund out and we'll shoot him in the morning. Anyway, that evening, we slept with the regular German guards. They didn't give us anything to eat at all day. And of course, the meal that we had was early that morning. The next morning, I was so tired that I fell asleep, and the Germans actually had to wake me up the next morning. They took us to a train and put us in some boxcars, didn't tell us where we were going or anything. We were on that train all day, and when we got off of it, we were in Hamburg. When I got off the train that night, it was the first time I saw what our bombs had done. The whole city was just shambled. It was just a wall here and a wall there. There wasn't anything like a whole building anymore. They marched us over to a pile of rubble, and I think it used to be the jail, because they took us down a flight of steps down below ground. It must have been at least 2 levels below ground that they took us. It put us in a little tiny room. There was 8 of us. They slammed the door shut, and we were in complete darkness. Then we found out there was water on part of the floor. There was no bunk, no nothing. All I could do is I took off one of my shoes and used it as a pillow, tried to get away from where the water was, and I spent the night that way. The next morning they came and put us back on the train again. We were in that train all day, and of course they wouldn't tell you where they were going, what they were doing with you, nothing. When we got off the train that night, we were in the outskirts of Frankfurt at a place called Dulag Luft. It's a transient state where they interrogate the prisoners and all that. Of course, we had no idea what they were going to do. Again, that day they didn't give us anything to eat either. Wait a minute, I'll take that back. They gave us one slice of German bread, and I'll explain the German bread later, smeared with something. We determined it was actually beets made into a kind of a jelly. But after you're hungry enough, anything tastes good. That night, I experienced my first bombing raid. Germany had deliberately built this prison camp right alongside of a great big chemical plant called IG Farben. And they did so deliberately, trying to keep Allied bombers from bombing it. But anyway, we were in this little tiny room, and the bombs started dropping, and it was horrible. It was the English trying to bomb the IG Farben factory. The English always dropped their bombs at night. Their bomb sites weren't as accurate as ours, and they did what they called carpet bombing. In other words, they dropped their whole bombs and hope they hit something. If I remember right, there were 4 or 5 prisoners killed that night during the bombing raid. Then the next morning, they took us into this room. It was horrible. There were about maybe 500 of us that had been captured the days before. And you were sitting there and you could hear every horrible sound, people screaming, cursing, begging for mercy, gunshots. All you could imagine that it was involved torture. You were sitting there for hours at a time just listening to these horrible sounds. A German would come out and take one prisoner at a time. That was the last you saw them. They never came back. And you were just horrified sitting there, knowing fully well that pretty soon there would be your turn. I can still see this German guard. If Hollywood would have chosen him, they couldn't have done a better job. He was a real short, squatty guy. The first thing you noticed, he only had one arm. Second thing you noticed was a great big scar right across his face, so deep that one of his eyes were missing. To get you where he wanted you to go, he would take his gun barrel and either slap you on one side or the other side or poke you. He took me into this room where there was this German officer. I recognized he was an officer and gave him my best salute. And he looked at me and he says, you see, then he acted like he was my best friend. He says, you look like you haven't been hurt too badly. Is that correct? And I said, yes, sir. He said, well, you must have people back home that are wondering what has happened to you. I said, that's right. He said, well, we do that through the Red Cross. Oh, just before that, he says, ja, Schrenk, we have been expecting you. Where have you been? He says, he reached into the file and he had a whole file on me. He had the name of my mother and father, that I was born on a small dairy farm, that I had a brother and a sister. Yeah, we know all about you. It's just amazing. But anyway, he says, we do that through the Red Cross. Here, fill out this form. So I looked at it and wanted to know mother's name, father's name, address. Well, he had all that. So I filled it out. Then the next couple lines, all military. What kind of plane were you flying? What kind of bombs were you dropping? What was your intended target? Just on and on and on. And of course, I wouldn't fill that out. I handed it back to him. Oh, he just went into a rage and he slapped me across the face. You think that we don't know what kind of plane you were flying? Write it down. And of course, we were told every time we didn't want to answer something, give your name, rank, and serial number. So gave my name, rank, and serial number. He would kept on slapping me across the face. The guard behind would jab your gun barrel into me, and this went on like, it seemed like eternity. And then pretty quick he says, if you don't answer the next question, we send you to the Gestapo. He says, the Gestapo knows how to make you talk. He'll be glad to talk. For the younger generation, the Gestapo was a horrible, horrible police force. Anyway, kept on like that. Then finally, he put the gun barrel right against my head. He says, you better answer the next question or else. Of course, I remembered the gunshots, didn't know what to do. I gave him a name, rank, and serial number. He banged me on top of the head. The German guard behind me gave me a great big boot in the rear, and I went flying out of the door, and I knew that interrogation had ended. I found out later on, if I would have given even the little bit more information, they would have beat me to a pulp trying to get more. But that was, to me, it was very, very scary. A few days later, they took away, we were still in our flying clothes, and they took our flying boots and stockings away, claiming that that was going to prevent us from escaping. Of course, yes, it would. They marched us to the railroad station, and you have never seen such angry people. I mean, they were shaking their fists at us, they were yelling at us, they were punching us. I didn't see it happen, but somebody said one woman even pushed a guy right in front of a train, and he was hit by the train. We never did find out if he was killed or just injured, but I mean, you just knew that you were weren't in a very friendly crowd. They put us in the boxcars again, and we had about a 4 or 5 day train ride. When we arrived, we found out we were in, wait a minute, I'm getting the two Heidekrug, East Prussia, which is part of Lithuania now. On the way, the only food that they gave us was they would stop the train. They had some kind of powder that they'd put in a can and use the steam from the engine, and it appeared to me or tasted kind of like dried peas. They made a soup out of. You maybe got about a little bit of a dab of it each day. I mean, by the time you got there, you were just absolutely starving. When we got to the name of the camp was Stalag 6. When we got there, they took away all our clothes and issued us new clothes, but it was all mishmash. My pants was American, my jacket was English. They did give us the overcoat. I had a pair of English combat boots, which turned out to be terrible in my case. I'll mention that a little bit later, why I'm saying that. And we got our first meal, which consisted of boiled cabbage. Just a little. They only fed us once a day at any of the prison camps, but so many times you didn't even get that. It was a very horrible place. It was a great big room. All of us in that room were bunked so close together that you hardly had room to walk in between. They were stacked 3 high. But what was the worst part was the bunk. They were made out of wood, and all you had for a mattress was a burlap bag that had just a few wood shavings in it. To support it, they had 4 boards about 6 inches wide. You had one board for your feet, one for your hips, one for your shoulder, and one for your head. So the whole mattress just went like that. It was the most uncomfortable thing. You didn't have any pillow or anything like that. You had one blanket, then another blanket we called the German blanket. I'll have to explain that. It was real thin. If you held it up against the light, it looked more like a window screen, and I could never figure out, it had great big long black hair, about anywhere from 2 feet to 3 feet long. And I couldn't figure out where in the world hair like that would come from. Later on, I found out it was from the death camps. That was the hair that they had sheared off the women. They hardly did anything to keep you warm. I mean, it was horrible. The food there was horrible. Like I said, a lot of times there was boiled cabbage. Sometimes there was just even boiled clover. If you got anything, thank you. If you got anything with meat in it, it had just all kinds of maggots in it. You were so hungry, the first couple meals you'd pick out the maggots. Then after a while you'd look what you'd picked out and you were still hungry. When you get hungry enough, you'll eat anything, you'll find out. We were so starved that we were just losing weight rapidly. And I don't think any of you have ever been starved that bad, but you've just got that gnawing feeling, pain in your stomach, day in and day out. I had that feeling from the time I was captured to the time I was liberated. The pain was so bad that a lot of people even ate dirt to try to get away from that terrible, horrible feeling. And the Germans changed diet on us. They started feeding us cans. The can was about 4 inches across and about 8 inches high. It didn't have any label or anything. It was just a plain can. It was definitely fish. We think it was cod liver oil. Cod livers after the oil was extracted. But the problem was, it was summertime, and they had run bayonets through the cans, let them thoroughly spoil, and then gave them to you. When you get the can, it would just be oozing, boiling, but you had two choices: either eat it and get sick, or starve. I still remember I would hold my nose shut, put a little bit on a spoon, take it and swallow it just as quick as I could, and hope it would stay down. It was the most horrible stuff that you can ever imagine. There was rock in the compound. I have no idea what it was. It was a kind of a pinkish rock, a crystal type, and somebody found out that if you chipped away at that, it had a real salty taste. And we'd mix salt in with that fish, trying to partially mask it. And believe it or not, there was a huge rock. By the time we left, that whole rock was consumed. It wasn't all salty. It was kind of half sand and half some type of salt. It wasn't table salt because it was pinkish looking. Excuse me. We were at this camp for about 6 months. And pretty soon, we heard the flashes of light at night. Then, pretty quick, we heard the roar of cannon, and we knew that the Russian army was closing in. We were just elated. Oh, I forgot to tell you, in our barracks every night at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. We'd have to put shutters on the windows, and we couldn't take them off until 9 o'clock the next morning. In other words, we couldn't leave the barracks. There was absolutely no sanitation of any kind. There was a big bucket off in one corner. That's what we used for the latrine. There were so many people using that bucket that by morning it never held. And sanitation was just didn't exist at all. All you could do is every day is take that bucket down to the latrine, which is must have been almost about a half a block away, and dump it. One morning, some poor guy got up. The Germans had sold everybody's watches, so we couldn't really tell what time it was. Some poor guy got up. He went to the latrine. When he came back, he was shot. He wasn't the only one shot, of course. So many guys went berserk and would try to climb the barbed wire enclosure. Another thing about the barbed wire enclosure, there was a warning wire about 20 feet in from it. All it was just a string on light posts. And one day, one POW was talking to the other, and he put his hand on the post. The German shot right through his hand. There was absolutely no medical help or anything. We had guys in our barracks that had all kind of shrapnel wounds. They were oozing all during the time I knew them. We also had quite a number of guys that were badly burned when they bailed out of the airplane. You could just see where their oxygen mask was and where their goggles were. The rest of their face was just badly, badly burned. And I can remember another one of my friends had half of the foot blown off. Absolutely no medical attention at all. Anyway, back to the Russians. We knew that the Russians were coming. We were hoping for liberation. The Germans had a different idea. They gave us about 10 minutes notice to pack our gear and be at the main entrance, and they marched us to the 40 and 8, what they call 40 and 8 boxcars. 40 and 8 was from World War I. They were meant for 40 men or 8 horses. Anyway, they started to load us about noon. It was July and it was quite hot. When the car would be full, the Germans had bayonets. They would jab the guys in the doorway, make room for more men. More people would go in and jab them. I mean, till we were in there just like sardines, where you couldn't even sit down and they slammed the door shut. We were in there the rest of the day with no water, no food, nothing, and the temperature just soared. The train didn't leave the station till well after dark. When we awakened, we were in the port of Memel, and they started to load us on 2 great big coal ships that they had captured from the Russians. The ships had been used to haul coal. The only opening was just a little bit of about 4 feet wide that they made us crawl down on a ladder. All during the time you were going down there, they were jabbing you with bayonets and everything, and they kept on more men. At last there wasn't even room to sit or anything. We were in that ship for 4 days standing upright because we couldn't sit down. Only thing they the drinking water, they would lower a bucket with our drinking water. But there were so many men that hardly anybody got a drink. But what I was going to say, it was the same bucket that they lowered that you relieved yourself in. When it came back down, it had your drinking water in it. Again, when you get hungry and thirsty enough, you will drink anything. I did manage to get one little tiny sip of water. We were on that ship for 4 days. Some of the guys went berserk. How they got up on deck, I'll never know. And they jumped overboard, and the German guard shot them. Later on, I heard one of the German guards laughing at how much fun it was using them for target practice. When we finally got to the port, we were in Stettin, Poland. They took us off the ship and again loaded us into boxcars, but now this time we had more room. The car was divided in half, and they had some real young, what we call Marines, guarding us. And they made us put on, it was July, but they made us put on our overcoat, and then they shackled us in twos. I could, of course, speak German, and I started asking some of the Marines, started talking to them, and I finally asked them how old they were. They were all 12 and 13 years old, and real trigger happy, and I think they were more afraid of us than what we were afraid of them. Anyway, that train ride lasted 1 day, and we were at WWII, Poland. They took us off the train. Of course, we were still shackled with our overcoats on. And here comes this German officer. He says, "Today is your lucky day. Today you're not only going to get one Red Cross parcel, you're going to get 2 of them." I could hardly believe my ears. Sure enough, they brought out and gave us each 2 parcels. Up to that time, a few times we got 1 parcel, but most of the time you only got a parcel for 8 to 10 people. As soon as they had the last parcel handed out, I heard him tell affix bayonets. Then they released the dogs and started chasing us down the road. And when you're shackled with somebody, the arms, you're trying to carry a parcel under each arm, your arm just gets raw from them trashing. They were bayoneting people, not to kill them, but just to give them very bad wounds. One poor guy had 60 dog bites, and of course no medical attention. They ran us. They were hoping that we would can it and they could shoot us, but we didn't. They ran us for 5 kilometers, which is roughly 3 miles. And when they're running you like that, when you're so weak and practically everybody dropped both their packages. A few of them kept one. I don't know how I did it, but I kept both of mine. We got to that camp. It's July, and of course we hadn't had water, we hadn't had food. We were just desperate. There was a well there that wouldn't leave us anywhere near it. The German guards started pumping water and throwing it at us, and everything. All of a sudden, one guy in the crowd started singing "God Bless America." We all joined in. And, oh, did that ever infuriate the Germans that we were in such miserable shape, and yet we could taunt them right back. They left us out in that compound, still didn't give us any water or anything for the rest of the day. And then they did what I call a strip search. They took the shackles off of us and took us and made us strip and be searched. The German guard that I had was one of the most, that I was assigned to, was one of the most brutal persons that you could ever see. We had called him Ham Hands. He stood at about 6 feet, but he real hunched over, and his hands were just unusually large. I had encountered by him. I'd been booted in the rear and everything by him. One thing he'd like to do is come and cuff you across the ear. I'm sorry. and break your eardrum. He grabbed both of the Red Cross parcels, and I hollered at him. I said, "They're Red Cross and they're mine." He took out his pistol and he whammed me on top of the head. I just collapsed on the floor. I regained myself and again wouldn't let go of the parcels and again insisted that they were mine. He whammed me across the chin a couple of times. 5 different times I insisted they were mine, and 5 different times he hammered me across the head. I finally decided that either give him the parcels or I'd get killed. So I let him have the parcels, and as soon as he went to put them away, I grabbed my belongings and scooted out the door. Didn't go through the strip search. I knew he was going to come after me. He came out looking for me. I was lucky enough. I dove in with some of the guys. My head was a bloody mess, just dripping all over, and I covered my overcoat across my head so he couldn't see the blood. He came out looking for me. He was swearing and everything, looking for me. He kept on walking back and forth, and he finally gave up and went inside. If he would have found me, I would have been shot right there. Anyway, when they finally let us into the barracks, our so-called meal was waiting for us. When we doled it out, it was a pile of carrots, just the way they were pulled out of the ground. It was only July, so I mean they were just little tiny carrots about like that. My ration was 2 carrots. I was so hungry, I ate carrots, leaves, and all. You know, it's about an hour, and I've got a long ways to go yet. So I think, if it's all right with everybody, I'm going to call it quits today before we go on the German Death March. That'll be the next thing I'll be talking about. So I thank everybody for coming. I hope my speech wasn't too boring. And believe it or not, everybody that came is still here, and I can hardly believe it. Does anybody have any questions that they'd like to ask? Feel free to ask anything. Go ahead.
You survived this. Were any of the people that you were with in this camp or along the way, did any of them survive?
Oh, yes. My whole crew actually survived. Yes, ma'am. When I was shot down, I was 185 pounds. I can't tell you exactly what I weighed when I was liberated. I would guess it to be quite a bit below 100 pounds. The reason I can't tell you is because we didn't have a physical for at least, not until I actually got back to the United States. They didn't give us a physical. That's another thing. Today is my anniversary of being liberated. 77 years ago today is when I was liberated. The bread, I looked it up after the war, was 1/3 sawdust, 1/3 rye, and 1/3 of some type of vegetable like rutabaga or potatoes or anything like that. The bread did not have any leavening at all, so it was just a very solid chunk. Surprisingly, it did not taste that bad, although, like I said, when you're hungry, anything tastes good. It was one of the things that we really appreciated because you could kind of hoard it, and when they didn't feed you for several days, if you had just even a little chunk, it would help quite a bit. Of course, we only got, we're supposed to get 1/7 of a loaf per week, and towards the end of the war, we hardly got any. Anybody else? Yes?
You were going to say something about your shoes.
The what?
Your shoes.
Oh, yeah, German, English combat shoes. What was bad about that, the first place, they were just a little bit too narrow for me, so they never really did fit. The bad part of it was, well, they were worn when I got them already, so they had seen their best days. But English combat shoes had hobnails made out of metal in the sole, so that they could grip the ground. We were marching in the Death March. The secondary roads were made out of field rock that were about 3 to 4 inches across, just laid against each other. So when your foot would come down, especially in the wintertime when we were marching, if it was a little bit slippery, every time your foot come down, your foot went a different direction. The hobnails were especially bad because they were metal and they conducted the cold right up through the inner sole. Towards the end, when I was on the Death March, the shoes were so worn I could actually see my toes with my shoes on. We had only have one pair of stockings, and of course they were well worn out, where all I had on was a kind of a band around my ankle. Anybody else?
Well, we want to hear the rest of it for sure. I mean, and another program, but publicize that.
Good. If I can't make it in one program, I'll make it in 2.
What was that week you talked about? How did it get its name?
Big week? Like I said, big week, it was when air superiority changed from Germany having air superiority to the Allies having air superiority. It didn't just, I don't know why they're called week, because it certainly spanned more than that. But that's where they figured that the turning point was during Big Week. No, I think they produced gunpowder and things like that.
That company made poison gas, though, for the chamber.
They perhaps did. All I know it was a chemical plant. I did know that it made gunpowder. could be. It could be they made that gas that they used in the gas chambers as well. The Zyklon B is what it was called. Thank you very much, everybody. It's certainly appreciated. I hope it wasn't too bad.
No, it was excellent, excellent.
See you at happy hour tomorrow night.
Happy hour to. No, that's.
No, Thursday.
Yeah, that's